Professor Clark, you are an emeritus professor at St. Lawrence University in New York State, and you are the author of 5 books and over 50 articles and book chapters in the mental health area. Your recent book, Empathy and Mental Health, has just been translated into Romanian by Trei Publishing House, and I am sure that students and practitioners will gain new insight and useful advice from your book. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure, Victor.
Your first professional position was as a school counselor. And at that time, as you describe in your book, a middle school student said to you, "I hate school." You tried to show empathy, but it didn't work at the time. Why didn't you succeed to respond empathically at that time? And how would you respond now, considering all the experience you have accumulated?
All right. Yes, that was my first counseling experience as a school counselor, called junior high school those days. So I think at that time, what I did, where someone would say, "I hate school, I can't stand this class," or this teacher and that, I would repeat that in ways, and I may say, "You're angry or upset," or whatever is the case. And what I was doing then was how I was trained. And that was the time in the early 70s when there was a behavioral emphasis that you had to say something to a person, but there wasn't much more than that. And if you could identify a feeling. So it was largely thought of as empathy as reflection of feelings. So it was limited. And I was able to get a pretty good handle on, but when it went beyond that, I was limited, and limited in terms of 2 ways: understanding the person, the client, and building a relationship. It doesn't go too far if you just say you're upset or you're angry and this. It's rather shallow, superficial too. So what I found after a number of years of clinical experience and further school experience, that there seemed to be, when you talk with someone and sustain interest and focus, there is an emotional connection that's essential. You have to make it with that person so that they feel understood or that they matter. And that would seem to be continuous throughout. Then there's another part too, which is to understand the person. And so as you're listening, making a connection, you have to understand and express that. So it seemed to me that empathy became understanding a client and emotionally connecting with the person. So that, and as I looked further into empathy, I found very, very shallow definitions of the topic throughout the literature in counseling, psychotherapy, and beyond various services. So that then became my quest to try to get a handle on what is empathy. And it's elusive, it's difficult, and there's certainly a lack of consensus in the field on what is empathy.
Empathy is seen even by some scholars as a very subjective and personal experience. But your book, Empathy and Mental Health, dedicates a special chapter, for instance, to objective empathy. How could empathy be objective?
Right. When you hear the term objective, it seems analytical, kind of emotionally detached. So that would seem to be quite the opposite of what most people would consider within the realm of what empathy is. So it hasn't been ventured into as territory to understand as empathy. But if you go a little deeper what is objective material in counseling and psychotherapy? And it may be such things, let's say, defense mechanisms, Freudian concept in this, and Anna Freud's work. And if you look at those, they have been studied for decades, and they form certain patterns. So if you take that and say, well, does that help me understand a person? Does that help me connect? Which is really the sum of what empathy is. That would seem to be, well, why not use that on behalf of a client and as you work with them? For example, let's say a client is talking in a rather muted tones, kind of low key, and going on a topic that typically evokes quite a lot of emotion. Let's say some form of abuse or strong rejection. Then you might say, without thinking of the objective defense mechanisms, well, that person is just not talking about it as much as they could. And it doesn't go very far. But if you put it in the sense of an objective view of, say, defense mechanisms, then you think there's a pattern here. There is a sustained way of operating for this person. And also, and in this case would be isolation. They're isolating their affect from their reasoning capacities. So that then helps give a much stronger sense of understanding the client, and then you're able to connect with them because you know where they're coming from. And further, it gives a sense of where we can go with it to modify that defense. So the objective then is using a reasoning capacity of the counselor or therapist. And you're looking to referential information, data. Let's say countertransference could be another area. The DSM could be another. Theories of counseling. All of this material that counselors and therapists are trained in can be drawn from, as you would think, to illuminate a person's functioning. And then that becomes the whole objective way of understanding a client.
There is also an intersubjective aspect in empathy. You are talking about subjective, objective, and then interpersonal or intersubjective experience in empathy. What do you mean by that?
Sure. The concept of integral empathy is trifold. And so it begins initially with subjective. This is the resonating capacity of a therapist in listening to a client's stories. And it happens rather naturally if you're tuned in, empathically tuned in. Such things as, for example, you may identify with a client, not over-identify where you're becoming too involved, or too detached, under-identify. You identify with the person. So they say they've gone through a situation of insult, where they've been teased or picked on. Well, it's very likely most of us have able to identify instances in our life where we also were belittled by someone and made fun of. And so we can connect with that person. So the subjective is resonating. We can relate to the person because we can sense it in ourselves. And I talked about 3 other areas. You can also imagine something a person is talking about something like say a dream. You can imagine the dream. Well, we have that endowment. Oh, why can't we use it in ways? And then the idea of intuition. We intuit a person's, it's kind of based on our experience in our prior knowledge. So we bring that in the service of the person. And then finally, the last part of subjective is it's an embodied. I can feel it
Right.
in the sense of physiologically. So if you're talking, say, about eating, and a person may have an eating disorder, and they discuss taking in a lot of food, you almost sense a sense of gagging or maybe a fullness of your tummy. That then helps connect with and understand the client from subjectively. That's one. I hope I didn't go too long with that, but maybe I should go on to the other two, or
the second, the objective empathy you already
yes,
talked about, and what will be the third step or the third aspect?
Sure. By the way, these three you shift depending on the saliency of what is going on in session. So say I'm listening very keenly, I may be in a subjective mode. Then I shift because the client, I'm trying to figure out what's going on here. I may move into a more theoretical, conceptual notion, and that would be my objective. I go there. But then I need to say something. I need to express what I am encountering with an individual. It doesn't do a lot of good, or if I'm just taking it in, trying to make sense of it, and resonating and theorizing, I have to talk. I have to express. That's why there's always been an emphasis with empathy since the early 60s. Talking, you have to share what is being understood. So that third is interpersonal. And in that way, I express, I convey what I am making sense of. And so then and from this area, this gets into a whole topic of skills. I do this through a number of skills, far, far more than the reflection of feeling. In fact, I mentioned 14 stage skills and 14 strategic skills. These are what the counselor does, and they're all with an empathy base.
There are interventions in medicine, in social work, in brief therapies, where the expectations are that practitioners deliver quick solutions and that not a profound empathic understanding. Are there any moments when a helper could leave empathy aside and just apply their usual procedures?
Sure. One thing about empathy, where it's not seen as viable in some ways, particularly when with an emphasis on symptom relief, change for the client, their behavior. It may be nice to understand a client and provide support and listening, but there's a time crunch here. And so how do we move forward with empathy? And in this case, it would be a understanding that if you rush toward solution, then what can happen? It can hinder the pace of therapy and extend it, because typically a client, when they do not feel understood with along their journey, they resist. They may say, you don't get it. You're not with me on this one. I don't need this. There's a high dropout rate of therapy. Third, fourth session can get to a point where there's toward a majority of individuals quit. And when they're asked why, they say, I didn't like the person, the therapist. I didn't connect with them. They didn't understand me. So in a way, it seems like sensible to move quickly toward goals, symptom change. But unless the client feels understood, they're going to prolong treatment or resist it or drop out. And so it's self-defeating in a way. And secondly, if you don't understand, you're not understanding the client along this way, then your choice of treatment and strategies, techniques is probably not going to be just what is needed at the time. So it seems that empathy, although it's viewed initially as taking too much time, it may be, in a sense, a time saver.
I see. Empathy and therapeutic alliance seem to account for about 9% of the therapy outcome effects, as you write in your book. Does that figure do justice to empathy? And in addition, which are the other healing factors that make up the rest of 91% of efficiency ingredients?
Right. This is a lot of information in the literature on this. And typically, the therapeutic alliance, which is the goal consensus, and a rapport with a client, a working relationship, is another 9%. There's 9% for techniques and another 9% for methods and such. And so, but the largest component is the client, their variables, which is about a third. So they bring in who they are. But if we look at the way empathy is understood today in the research and literature, it's narrowly conceived. It's largely a sense of maybe reflection or empathy as an entity, and it's not broad as we have been talking about. So if you build in what empathy could be, the potential of it, it goes far more, although this is not measured, because far more than 9%, because it would include the therapeutic relationship, you're building on that, understanding the client, the third that's unknown, and the techniques that I've been suggesting in that. And what can happen when you put that together, it starts building a model of a client. Not only do you, the client feels understood, but in your own mind, you're building a representation of the individual, so that then becomes more nuanced and more comprehensive the further, the more time you spend with them. Much the same way when you spend time with a person, do you feel you can understand them, or they feel understood with a friend or a relative and such. It doesn't have the same social kind of relationship, but it's almost a similar way to more deeply know a client. They know when you feel they understood and they feel connected with you. And maybe I failed to mention one other thing too, which is an empathic use of self. Empathic use of self is when you apply the integral empathy model. So as you resonate with an individual, that's you. That's the therapist. As you move toward a reasoning, objective, that's your knowledge and experience. And the third, as you imply an empathic use of self, is the relationship of interpersonal skills and strategies that occurs in through the process of empathic use of self.
Thank you, Professor Clark, for your precious explanations. And of course, thank you for reminding us in your book about the importance of empathy in mental health professions.
And thank you, Victor. It's been a pleasure talking to you.